Judas walked through the dim sanctuary as dust drifted around him like memories, refusing to settle, and he felt the old stone breathing against his palms as if it remembered every moment he tried to forget, while the wooden beams creaked above him, like tired witnesses waiting for truth to speak aloud. And he wondered why silence could feel heavier than confession when regret was supposed to lighten the soul, but only deepened the shadows inside him. While he questioned if a man could ever outrun the echo of a choice he barely understood, and the cold air pressed against his chest as if asking whether fear was just another form of faith turned inward, and he whispered to himself, "What if the wound I carry was never meant to heal?" Before noticing the hidden crack in the wall where the folded letter waited, like a heartbeat trapped in stone. And in that moment he felt destiny breathing near him, as if something unseen reached forward to pull him closer, leaving a tremor that asked a question he could not name, and ending with a silence that felt divine, yet unfinished. Miriam walked into the sanctuary with careful steps, her breath catching as she sensed the strange heaviness lingering in the air. The kind that makes a person feel like they have entered a memory instead of a room. And she wondered why the silence felt so watchful as she approached the front pillars, where faint footprints broke the dust in uneven paths, and she whispered a soft question to herself about who would return to a place everyone else had long abandoned, feeling her pulse quicken as she imagined the stories these walls had swallowed. And she touched one of the old carvings as if asking it to speak, sensing that something hidden had been disturbed, while a quiet ache stirred inside her as though the past had just exhaled and brushed against her soul. Eliam entered moments later, his steady presence grounding the space as he observed the sanctuary with the focus of someone who had spent his life reading silence as if it were scripture. And he noticed Miriam standing close to the carved pillar, with worry softening her expression, making him ask quietly whether she sensed the same shift he felt beneath the dust. And he walked toward her while his boots pressed softly into the debris, each step reminding him that history often hides more than it reveals. And he wondered aloud if truth chooses its own moment to surface, feeling a strange certainty that something once buried had begun to breathe again, leaving him with the uneasy belief that they had arrived precisely when they were meant to. The air shifted again as Tov entered, his steps light but uncertain as he scanned the sanctuary, with wide eyes that held more curiosity than fear. And he asked Miriam whether she felt something strange pulling through the room as if an old story had woken from sleep. And she nodded without turning, her touch still resting on the carved symbol, while Eliam crossed his arms thoughtfully, studying both of them as though measuring their reactions against his own quiet unease. And Tav took another step forward as if drawn by an invisible thread, admitting softly that he sensed a truth nearby, something fragile and waiting. And his voice trembled slightly as he asked whether secrets could choose the very moment they wished to be found. Miriam finally turned toward the far wall, drawn by a faint disturbance she couldn't explain. And she walked slowly until she reached the cracked section, where bits of stone had fallen in fresh patterns, making her heart pound as she knelt and studied the narrow gap, sensing that someone had touched this place with trembling urgency. And she called softly to Eliam, who approached with focused concern while Tav hovered behind them, unsure whether to breathe or stay silent. And Miriam brushed the dust aside with careful fingers, revealing a small trace of wax that made her chest tighten. And in that still moment she felt the sanctuary waiting, as though the past had left a message not meant for time but for this very instant. Judas stood in the dim corridor of his past, the memory pressing against him with the weight of choices he once believed were righteous. And he felt again the trembling breath he took on the night. Everything shifted when he had walked through the narrow alleys with a letter tucked against his chest like a burning stone he dared not release. And he remembered hearing distant voices, murmuring prayers that carried a hope he no longer knew how to hold, making him ask himself whether a man loses faith the moment he questions it or the moment he fears the answer. And he paused beneath a lantern that flickered weakly, as though wrestling with its own fading light, while he wondered if truth could ever find a path through a soul clouded by good intentions that had turned into wounds, leaving him unsure whether he had acted out of protection or fear disguised as duty. Miriam studied the letter's first revealed line, tracing the faded ink with her eyes while Eliam and Tav waited in heavy silence behind her. And she felt the heartbeat of a man she had once known more deeply than she admitted, pulsing between the words he left sealed in stone, making her whisper that he must have written this on a night when truth was too sharp to speak aloud. And she wondered whether regret had followed him like a shadow that grew darker each time he tried to step into the light, remembering fragments of their earlier conversations where he often spoke of burdens he feared would outlive him, and she felt a tremor inside her as she realized the letter wasn't simply a confession, but a plea from someone torn between devotion and dread, someone who believed he had run out of choices long before the world noticed he was struggling. Eliam stepped forward, his voice low as he explained that the letter's phrasing hinted at a decision shaped by forces Judas never fully understood, and he noted how the tone shifted between courage and fear, as though written by a man torn between speaking truth and protecting someone he could not name. And he told Miriam that such contradictions often came from souls who stood too close to the fire of consequence, while Tav listened with widened eyes, insisting softly that fear alone could not push a man to hide something this carefully. And Eliam nodded in thoughtful silence as he admitted that sometimes protection requires silence more than confession, leaving him wondering whether Judas believed he was saving someone at the cost of being remembered as the betrayer. Tav paced slowly, his footsteps echoing softly, as he said he could feel something deeper in the letter's tone, something that sounded like a warning rather than a confession. And he admitted he had read many old texts in his travels, but none had carried such tremors of fear mixed with devotion. And Miriam turned toward him with curiosity, as he explained that the phrasing reminded him of someone who believed danger was closing in, someone trying to shield another from a truth they feared would bring ruin. And Eliam listened with a frown as though considering a possibility he had long avoided, and Tav's voice softened as he wondered aloud whether Judas had written this not because he betrayed someone, but because he knew betrayal was coming for all of them. Miriam returned her gaze to the letter, feeling a growing tremor that echoed the unspoken truth buried between the lines, and she whispered that Judas must have carried a fear that did not belong solely to him, a fear shaped by someone else's danger, someone he felt compelled to guard, even if it cost him everything. And Eliam leaned closer with concern as he asked whether she believed the letter hinted at a person still unknown to them, while Tav stepped forward with hesitant urgency, suggesting that perhaps Judas had been forced into a choice none of them would have survived. And Miriam's breath caught as she wondered if his silence had been the only way he knew to keep the world from collapsing around the one he meant to protect, leaving her with a chilling sense that they had only uncovered the surface of a truth far larger than they imagined. Miriam read deeper into the next lines, her voice barely audible as she spoke the words that revealed Judas, wrestling with a fear that felt older than his choices, and she sensed the tremble behind his sentences as though each one had been written in the moment just before breaking, making her pause as she wondered whether anyone could carry such weight without shattering under it. And she whispered that he sounded like a man trying to hold back a storm he believed would swallow someone he cared for, leaving Eliam thoughtful as he leaned closer and traced the uneven strokes with his eyes, while Tav quietly stepped beside them as though entering a sacred moment, and Miriam felt a tightness in her chest as the meaning behind Judas's fear began to rise like a shadow taking shape. Eliam took the letter gently from Miriam's hands, lifting it into the lantern's glow as he murmured that Judas seemed to fear not judgment, but a consequence he believed would fall upon someone innocent. And he wondered aloud whether this fear had driven him to silence rather than confession. Sure, making Tav step forward with a question trembling at the edge of his voice about whether Judas had been trying to warn someone through these hidden words, and Eliam nodded slowly while he studied the neglected curves of ink, saying that sometimes the most painful truth is the one a person tries hardest to hide, and he felt a chill as the thought settled that Judas's silence might have been an act of protection that demanded a price he had never spoken. Tov moved around the altar, his voice low as he said. The wording reminded him of ancient writings in which warnings were disguised as confessions, and he explained that the repeated phrasing Judas used often appeared when a writer feared the wrong eyes might read the message, making Miriam exchange a troubled glance with Eliam as she whispered that the letter might hold a name intentionally obscured. And Tov nodded with nervous certainty as he traced a faint crease along the parchment, adding that he felt the letter carried a map of fear hidden behind gentle words, a map meant for someone specific, and he wondered softly who Judas had written for, and why he believed the truth would be safer buried in stone than spoken aloud. Miriam turned away from the altar, her breath uneven, as she remembered a conversation she once had with Judas on a quiet night when he spoke of dangers he feared but never named, and her voice trembled slightly as she told Eliam and Tov that Judas had carried a burden far heavier than anyone realized. A burden that shaped how he looked at the world, and she admitted that he often hinted at a person he felt responsible for protecting, though he never gave a name. And Eliam stepped closer with gentle concern as she confessed she had ignored the signs back then, believing they were simply shadows of his restless nature, while Tov listened with wide-eyed stillness as though sensing the story beginning to open in front of him like a door they had all avoided. Eliam returned to the altar and read the next paragraph aloud, his voice steady, but lined with concern as he revealed a phrase Judas repeated like a heartbeat held between fear and devotion, and the words spoke of someone Judas vowed to shield with silence, someone whose safety mattered more to him than his own fate, making Tov lean forward in disbelief as he asked why Judas would protect someone so fiercely that he allowed the world to believe he was the betrayer. And Miriam felt her breath catch as she wondered if the unnamed person could still be part of the truth they were unraveling. And Eliam closed his eyes briefly as he whispered that sometimes the cost of love is being misunderstood forever. Miriam steadied herself as she unfolded the next fragile section of the letter, her breath catching when she noticed the sudden shift in Judas's writing. Each line pressed harder into the parchment as though his hand trembled while he wrote, and she whispered that the tone felt like a confession collapsing under its own weight, making Eliam step closer with a worried furrow in his brow as he asked whether Judas had reached the point where fear finally swallowed his resolve. And Tov leaned forward with wide eyes as Miriam read a passage describing a night when shadows felt heavy enough to follow him, a night when he feared what truth might do to the ones he cared for. And she shivered as she admitted that Judas sounded like a man who believed the world would not forgive what he still dared not say. Eliam stepped away from the altar, pacing slowly as he explained that the deeper they read, the more he sensed Judas had been torn between warning someone and protecting them from knowing the danger at all. And he wondered aloud whether Judas believed his silence was the only shield he had left, making Miriam follow him with her eyes as she recalled moments when Judas seemed lost inside thoughts he never dared to speak. And Tov asked whether a man could truly choose silence when truth demanded a voice, his tone trembling as though he recognized the same uncertainty within himself. And Eliam paused before answering that sometimes silence becomes the only lausvier. Tov lifted the lantern and brought it closer to the letter's next lines, the flame trembling as he read a passage describing how Judas felt the weight of a community's wounds pressing into his heart. And he murmured that Judas seemed to believe the betrayal had shaped not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him, making Miriam close her eyes briefly as she felt the truth settling like a stone in her chest, while Eliam studied Tov with quiet seriousness, noting how the young scribe's voice softened when he reached the part where Judas wondered whether truth could heal or only deepen the scars already carved into the village. And Tov whispered that Judas had written like a man afraid of reopening a wound that never stopped bleeding. Miriam moved away from the altar, drawn toward the sanctuary's far corner where moonlight pooled gently on the floor, and she confessed that Judas once spoke to her about the burden of holding truths that were not fully his to share, making her voice shake slightly as she remembered how he looked at her that night with a mixture of longing and fear. And she admitted she had dismissed his worry as restless imagination instead of the warning it now seemed to be. While Ilium approached her slowly and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, reminding her that regrets often hide in the quietest parts of memory, and Tov watched them with patient sympathy, as though witnessing a past wound releasing its first breath of healing. Ilium returned to the altar and carefully unfolded the next crease in the letter, revealing a passage where Judas confessed that his silence had not been chosen out of selfishness, but out of love, twisted by fear, and he whispered that Judas wrote with the desperation of someone who believed revealing the truth would condemn the very person he tried to protect, making Tov inhale sharply, as he asked whether the hidden danger might have been closer than anyone realized, while Miriam felt a sudden trembling in her hands as she recognized a familiar pattern in Judas' phrasing, a pattern he once used when he feared speaking too plainly, and she murmured that the letter's deepest revelations were still waiting in the lines they had not yet dared to unfold. Miriam unfolded the next brittle segment of the letter, her breath catching when she realized the ink deepened into darker strokes, as though Judas wrote these lines while fighting panic, and she whispered that his words no longer sounded like fear alone, but like a desperate attempt to explain a choice he believed no one would ever understand, making Ilium step closer with somber eyes as he asked whether these lines might finally reveal the moment that pushed Judas into silence. And Tov leaned forward with widened attention as Miriam read a passage describing how Judas felt forced to shield someone from a truth sharp enough to destroy them, a truth he believed only he could bear, and she trembled as she said, "The letter felt less like a confession now, and more like a final plea from a man convinced he had run out of time." Ilium took the letter gently, his thumb brushing the uneven ink as he murmured that Judas described someone he vowed to protect no matter the cost, and he noted the way Judas repeated a phrase that sounded like a promise made in a moment of deep fear, a promise he feared breaking would bring danger to the one he guarded, making Miriam whisper that Judas sounded like a man who carried guilt, not for what he had done, but for what he believed might happen if he spoke. And Tov anxiously asked whether Judas had been caught between two impossible choices, his voice trembling as Ilium nodded, saying some truths were built like traps that destroy either way, leaving him to wonder whether Judas had sacrificed his own legacy to save another. Tov moved the lantern closer, his voice tightening as he read a section where Judas confessed that he feared the village would collapse under a truth meant for only one person, and he murmured that Judas sounded like a man who believed revealing his burden would destroy the very thing he wished to protect, making Miriam close her eyes as memories surfaced of nights when Judas seemed overwhelmed by fears he refused to name, and Ilium exhaled heavily, saying the letter's tone carried the sorrow of someone who accepted blame as a shield, even when it meant others would judge him forever. And Tov whispered that such sacrifice could only come from a love stronger than fear, yet suffocated by it. Miriam stepped back, pressing her hand to her chest, as she whispered that Judas once told her there were truths that hurt more when spoken than when carried alone, and she admitted she never understood the depth of his pain until now, feeling her heart tightening as she realized he had been trying to protect someone, even while drowning beneath the consequences. And Ilium approached her with steady compassion as he asked whether she believed Judas might have written these lines for her, making her shake her head slowly as tears shimmered in her eyes, while Tov watched with a mixture of fear and tenderness, sensing that the truth looming behind the letter was connected to Miriam in a way none of them had expected. Ilium unfolded the final half of the letter's remaining section, revealing lines written with shaking strokes that seemed to waver under the lantern's light. And he read aloud the moment Judas admitted he had acted not out of disloyalty, but out of desperate protection for someone unnamed, someone he feared would be destroyed if the truth reached them, making Tov gasp softly as he asked why Judas would let the world believe he betrayed everyone, rather than reveal the danger. And Miriam felt her knees weaken as she recognized a familiar rhythm in the words, a rhythm Judas once used when speaking to her in moments of vulnerability, and she whispered that the truth hidden in the letter was more personal than any of them realized, her voice trembling as though standing on the edge of a revelation that could rewrite everything they believed. The sanctuary fell into a deep quiet as Eliam spread open the next creased section of the letter, his voice trembling slightly as he read Judas's words, describing the crushing fear that truth could shatter lives if spoken too soon. And Miriam moved closer as though pulled by an unseen thread, her heart pounding as she heard hints of a name never fully written yet, lingering behind every hesitant line, making Tav whisper that Judas sounded like a man pleading with the future to treat his silence gently, and Eliam admitted the words felt like the final struggle of a soul, torn between revealing everything or letting the world believe a lie, while Miriam pressed her hands together as though holding something fragile inside her, and she murmured that the truth was no longer hiding in the ink, but rising through every breath they took. Miriam stepped back, feeling a growing ache spreading through her chest as she whispered that Judas's phrasing carried the echo of a promise he once made to someone he could not name, and she confessed that the rhythm of his words felt painfully familiar, as though written for a person he feared might lose everything if the truth surfaced, making Eliam lift his head slowly as he asked whether she believed Judas wrote the letter to protect her, and Tav stared at her with wide uncertainty, sensing the enormity of what her silence implied, while Miriam's voice faltered as she admitted she once sensed Judas was guarding something too large for him alone, but she never imagined the cost he paid to keep that promise hidden. Tav moved to the altar again, his fingers tracing the faded lines as he murmured that Judas seemed terrified of what would happen if the village discovered the name hidden between the sentences, and he noted how Judas avoided writing it, replacing it with metaphors that trembled with fear and longing, making Eliam frown as he asked whether the letter suggested the person Judas protected was in danger from someone within the community. And Tov said softly that the phrasing felt like a shield raised against unseen threat, while Miriam's breath slowed as she remembered moments when Judas grew quiet whenever danger was mentioned, and she whispered that maybe he feared someone would be punished for a truth they never knew existed. Eliam folded his arms and spoke with quiet heaviness, saying that if Judas truly sacrificed his own name to protect someone, then revealing the truth now could reopen wounds the village buried decades ago. And Tav argued that truth deserved the light, even if painful, his voice carrying a fire shaped by youthful conviction, while Miriam stood still, torn between the need to understand and the fear of destroying what little peace remained. And Eliam said the village might react with anger or disbelief, remembering Judas only as the betrayer they chose to blame. And Miriam whispered that sometimes the weight of truth is heavier when carried by more than one soul, leaving their decision trembling on the edge of revelation. Miriam moved back toward the altar as though pulled by a force beyond her choosing, her fingers brushing the parchment almost reverently as she whispered that Judas must have feared the truth would harm her more than any lie spoken about him, and she admitted her heart felt caught between grief and understanding as she realized he had chosen to become the village's villain rather than risk placing the burden on her, making Eliam lower his gaze with soft sorrow, while Tav stepped closer with hesitant compassion, and Miriam said the letter felt less like a confession and more like a final sacrifice, written by a man who believed silence was the only way to save her, leaving the three of them standing in a silence thick enough to feel like destiny waiting for their decision. Eliam unfolded the final section of the letter, his breath tightening as he read the trembling lines Judas wrote with the last of his strength, and he murmured that these words felt like the breaking point where a man finally accepted the cost of his silence, making Miriam step closer with a trembling resolve as she sensed the truth hovering just beyond the ink. And Tav leaned in with wide, fearful eyes as the passage revealed Judas questioning whether the world would ever forgive what it never understood. And Eliam whispered that Judas wrote these sentences as though placing his final heartbeat onto the page, while Miriam pressed a shaking hand to her lips as she wondered if the truth about to be revealed would free them all or reopen every wound. The village tried to bury. Miriam steadied herself as Eliam read the next lines, revealing Judas's admission that the person he protected was someone bound to him by fate more deeply than either of them understood. And she gasped softly when the writing hinted at a connection, shaped by choices they made in secret moments long before the betrayal, making Tove whisper with awe that Judas wrote as though entrusting his final truth to her alone. And Eliam looked at her with a heavy, knowing expression as he said, the letter seemed directed toward a single heart, not a village. While Miriam's breath trembled as she confessed, she once felt Judas was guarding something meant for her, but never imagined he would carry the entire burden to his grave. Tov moved closer to the altar, his voice quiet but steady, as he read the last full paragraph. Judas wrote, describing a night when he realized the danger threatening the village was aimed at the one person he could not bear to lose. And he murmured that Judas wrote with the urgency of someone who believed only silence could shield her, making Eliam lower his head as though honoring the magnitude of Judas's sacrifice, while Miriam's heart pounded as she whispered that Judas must have feared revealing the truth would destroy her far more deeply than losing his reputation. And Tov, said Judas, seemed to accept the role of betrayer because it was the only shield strong enough to draw danger away, leaving all three of them shaken by the love hidden in Judas's silence. Eliam stepped back and said the village deserved to know the truth, but Miriam lifted her eyes with a calm sadness as she whispered that revealing Judas's secret might break the peace he sacrificed everything to preserve. And she admitted she could not decide whether honoring his truth meant exposing it or protecting the silence he died for, making Tov speak with trembling conviction that truth, once found, demands a voice. Yet his uncertainty flickered through the words, while Eliam told them that whatever choice they made would redefine Judas's legacy forever. And Miriam closed her eyes as she felt Judas's presence in every breath, knowing the burden of decision had now passed from him to her. Miriam stepped toward the altar with trembling purpose, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter as she whispered that Judas had carried the truth to protect her, and she said she would not let his sacrifice turn to dust beneath the weight of judgment, making Eliam watch with pained understanding as she declared the letter would remain hidden, not as a denial of truth, but as the final honoring of the man who gave everything to guard her life. And Tov swallowed hard as he realized the choice had been made, his voice small as he asked whether silence could still be a form of love, while Miriam folded the letter gently and whispered that some truths were written not to be spoken, but to guide the hearts of the ones who finally read them.